In 2010, my great-uncle passed away. It was a sad occasion for everyone in the family, obviously. Well, everyone except for me. You see, Darren and I had never really gotten along because, well, he chose to torment me in 100 different ways when I was a child. Kids remember these things. Kids remember the feelings they had growing up, and if something frightens them bad enough or often enough, they do everything to avoid that thing in the future. And that's the case with myself and my Uncle Darren. He would do things while no one else was around, and then threaten to hurt me if I told on him. And one time I was running down the concrete stairs from the smokehouse to meet my mother, who had just pulled into the driveway to take me home. And Darren reached up and snagged my ankle, toppling me off the side of the steps and onto the hard ground below. And I ended up with badly cut hands and knees. And that time he laughed, and told me he would kill my mother if I got him in trouble. I told my mom that I tripped because I was running and got scolded for running down those dangerous steps. And no one ever believed me when I tried to tell them about my Uncle Darren. Now, he was one of the family favorites as far as I could tell. And maybe he didn't get that ugly mean streak in him until after I was born. I stopped trying to tell people about his cruelty and just started avoiding him when I could. At least at most family gatherings. I didn't have to be alone with him. It bothered me because I couldn't go stay with my aunt for fear of what he might do. She was like a grandmother to me, and I always adored her. I'll never figure out how she ended up with such a rotten man. I'd found out 3 days before he died that my wife was pregnant. We hadn't told anyone in the family yet. We were waiting for the next time we were at the family gathering so we would surprise everyone with the news. And the next family gathering was to be the following Sunday. And of course, I postponed the announcement when I found out about Uncle Darren. I attended the funeral and hid the fact that I was relieved my child would never be around such an overbearing and cruel person. Well, at least my child would never be around Uncle Darren anyway. A week after Darren's funeral, when everyone except my Aunt Tilda was getting back to normal, we announced the pregnancy. The usual congrats and squeals of delight greeted us at every house. We hadn't waited until the next family gathering, or we would have been waiting months to tell everyone. We didn't want to be toting around an infant, introducing him or her to each family member, and that would have just seemed rude. And I can't even begin to tell you what a whirlwind of commotion ensued until Cindy had our baby boy. It seemed that every waking minute was filled with my job, setting up the nursery and the new furniture, buying baby supplies, and then there were those rare times when everything seemed to calm down and we could relax. Well, I could anyway. Those were the exact times Cindy would either get seriously sick, puking and crying for hours at a time, or she would get one of those exotically weird and gross cravings for pickles and eggs or waffles with sauerkraut. In other words, there was never really a calm time when the both of us could just sit back and relax. Even the time we spent trying to pick out names for our son were fraught with Cindy's doubts about her ability to be a good mother, and tears as she had meltdowns, and frustration from me because, well, let's face it, I was exhausted. Finally, though, the big day came. It came in the middle of the night, and I rushed Cindy to the hospital. 18 hours later, she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The doctor frowned at first, and I asked him what was wrong. Before I could step past the table to see for myself, the nurse had snatched the baby and taken off across the room with her back to me. The doctor motioned for other nurses to attend Cindy and stepped in front of me, blocking my path to my newborn son. Where's she taking Anthony? Where's she taking him? Oh God, what's wrong with him? I was mortified that something was terribly wrong. My wife screamed and tried to get out of the stirrups and off the bed, and the nurses restrained her. The doctor said, "Your son's going to be fine. The nurse knows what she's doing. It was born with a coal over his face is all. She's removing it, clearing his airways and cleaning him up. Just go tell your wife and calm her down before she hurts herself." And I went to Cindy and assured her that everything was okay, even though I wasn't so sure about that myself. The nurse brought Anthony over and laid him on Cindy's chest. He was all bundled up and had his little fists clenched, his eyes squeezed shut, and his mouth puckered in limbo between a cry and a smile. He was perfect. Cindy cried, and I looked on in awe. The nurse came back to take Anthony to the nursery until Cindy was settled into a room, and she looked over her shoulder uneasily as the doctor and other nurses cleared out of the room. She leaned close to my wife and presented her with a small, plastic-wrapped, bloody thing. "This is the caul that was over his face, ma'am. Do you want to keep it?" Cindy looked horrified and shook her head as if the woman had just offered her a severed head. The nurse looked to me and held out the small grotesquerie. I shook my head. I didn't want anything to do with that. We were already keeping the umbilical cord. Wasn't that enough? "I'll have to incinerate it then. Old people used to keep these and dry them, so it was always in the family's keepsakes. Sometimes they buried them. Well, I'm sure you don't want to hear about this right now." She laughed nervously and took Anthony from the room. Cindy asked me, "What the hell?" Shaking my head, I shrugged. Anthony was born with that over his face. She had to remove it. I don't know what her deal is with it, though. 2 days later, we were taking Anthony home and delighted with the prospect of coming years as his parents. And the next 4 years were filled with joy as Anthony grew into a little boy full of energy, questions, and awe. And Uncle Darren had become a distant memory. Now, I should pause here to say we had no pictures or portraits of Uncle Darren in our house. My Aunt Tilda, naturally, had many pictures, but had taken them all down and put them in storage the summer after Darren's death, because she moved out of the house and my cousin moved in. My family doesn't hang many pictures around in their houses, so Anthony was never exposed to Uncle Darren in form. During Anthony's 4th year, he was with me a lot of the time. His mother had a full-time job outside the home, and that left me with the little man to do as we pleased with our days. I worked from an office at home and could do most of my work in the evenings. I took full advantage of having so much time with my only son. We frequented the parks, the kids' museums, nature walks, you name it, we did it that year. When autumn settled in, we started visiting family that we hadn't seen in a while. And that's the perfect time of year to catch up with everyone. The crops had been cleared, the vegetables had been canned, and the busy outdoor life was slowing down, giving everyone time in the evenings to sit and chat over cups of coffee and big slices of homemade apple pie. It was still warm enough to take Anthony outside and let him play in the spacious yards, and we even took to flying a kite in one of the acre-large fields of the family farm. It was also that time of year when everyone in the family started having huge garage sales, and I never quite saw the upside of having yard sales, and never really had the patience to host them, but everyone else loved them. So, as a habit and a way to show respect, I always tried to stop and meander through one of the garage sales if I was in the area. My cousin texted and told me that I needed to come to his house, formerly my Aunt Tilda and Uncle Darren's house. He said that he found a sweet little treasure trove full of antiques in the smokehouse. Some of the stuff was from the early 1800s, and he said I might be interested in taking some of it home. And if not, well, he said they were all going into the garage sale the very next day. Now I told him I would come and have a look through the stuff, and then quickly forgot, as Anthony and I were at his favorite restaurant having ice cream that day. The next morning, however, I remembered, and that's where we headed. My cousin Joe wasn't married. He had no children, and lived mostly on a trust fund set up by his mother years earlier. There was enough in that fund that he could live off the interest alone as long as he didn't have ridiculously expensive bills to pay. And he didn't. He lived in the house for free, and his utilities were his only bills, per se. His cars had been paid off before he was 21, so he lounged around the big house playing video games and eating junk food. Not a lifestyle I could ever have lived, but whatever. The garage sale was in full swing by the time Anthony and I pulled into the long driveway and found a place to park. The first thing I noticed were 3 quilts strung up on a clothesline between 2 trees in Joe's front yard. Then I had helped my granny make one of those quilts and recognized the other as a wedding gift for another cousin. I hoped Joe had asked permission to put them in the sale. Usually those quilts were prized items in the family and no one sold them since my grandmother had died. As I unbuckled Anthony, I wondered what else Joe had seized for the sale. Aunt Tilda was there, and she rushed out to meet us. She bent as best as she could and held her arms wide for a hug from Anthony. Not remembering her, Anthony stopped and looked back at me, fear in his eyes. And I nodded and told her name, and he reluctantly went to her for a hug. Aunt Tilda had grown old in the past year since I'd seen her. She said single life just didn't fit her. She didn't like it a bit. There was too much stress and fear around her since Uncle Darren had died. And how could she have lived with him for so many years and not known how mean he really was under that thin veneer of good behavior? I'll never know. Joe swooped down and lifted Anthony into the air and imitated airplane noises as he flew him around the side of the garage and into the yard. Anthony told me to follow, and I did. Joe set him down and showed us into the storage building near the house. I left the antiques in here for you to look through. You're the only one who's not fished through it yet, though. Well, did everybody else get what they wanted? And I saw stacks of old pictures, some framed and some not, and I walked to them. Yep, wasn't much though. Nobody really wants to hang out to the past anymore. Really, I think you're about the only one. Anyway, the shit creeps me out. I mean, just look at it. But I figured I'd just let you get anything you want and then, well, I'm gonna get rid of the rest. I nodded, not understanding why any of it creeped anyone out. Least of all Joe. I mean, he was family. Joe went back to attend the sale with Aunt Tilda while Anthony and I sifted through the family's heirlooms, prized possessions, some junk, and handmade toys, which Anthony found enchanting. I chose a few of the framed portraits, some books, and a few toys for Anthony, and then we went out to the garage to look around. We ended up staying until dinner time, and it's tradition to have a huge hot dog, chili, and corn on the cob dinner during the autumn sales, and I don't remember how this got started, but it had been done ever since I was big enough to remember my first year at the sales. And after dinner, Joe escorted Anthony and I back to the car. We stopped on the way so Joe could put down the 6 bay doors and lock up for the night. Anthony wandered toward the back of the garage and just barely out of sight. I could still hear him plainly, so I didn't worry too much. He came back only a few minutes later. He was carrying 4 belts, folded neatly, and I knew whose they were before he handed them to me. I shook my head. Nah, buddy, we got toys already. You don't need these. Besides, they're way too big for you. I took them and handed them to Joe, shaking my head at him so he wouldn't give them back to Anthony. Anthony did something he'd never done before. He threw a fit. I mean the whole 9 yards. He cried, reached for the belts, jumped up and down, screamed that they were his. Well, that was quite shocking. But it had been a busy day, and I thought maybe he was just tired. I picked him up and tried to soothe him as I walked out. I didn't want to have Uncle Darren's khaki belts under any circumstances. "Daddy, the man gave them to me." He pointed towards the garage. Joe stopped locking the doors. "What man, little buddy?" Anthony pointed again. "In there," and he began to cry. Joe went back in and did a sweep of the garage only to find the sale stuff. No person in sight. Anthony was so upset that I took him back into the house to wash his face and get him some juice. And while we were inside, Aunt Tilda came to find out what the problem was, and Anthony again went into the spiel about the old man. I shrugged, and Joe shook his head when she looked to us. Her face went pale. "Those were Darren's belts." Tears welled in her eyes and she walked away. I knew whose belts they were. Joe knew who they belonged to. Darren was the only man in the whole family who wore khaki fabric belts with the little anchors on the brass closure. As we were leaving, Tilda came in again, carrying the belts. Anthony brightened immediately and reached for them. He hugged them to his chest and eyed me suspiciously. "Yeah, thanks, Aunt Tilda. He'll never give them up without a fight now." I was a bit peeved, but she didn't know how I felt about Darren, so I let it go for the moment. She asked us to follow her to the larger of the two living rooms and pointed at a large family portrait sitting on the floor. I'd not seen it since I was a teenager. There was Grandma and Grandpa sitting in the foreground, and their sons and daughters with their spouses standing in a semicircle around them. Anthony had seen Grandma's pictures before, and Grandpa's too. He'd even met Tilda's sister and her brother before they died, but there was no way he would be able to remember them. He was far too young. Without any prompting, Anthony smiled and tugged at my pant leg. "Daddy, that him, the old man." He held up the belts in his little fists. I was stunned silent. Tilda pointed to Grandpa and asked if that was the old man. Anthony shook his head and walked to the portrait. It was as tall as him. He put his chubby little finger right in the center of Darren's face. "That old man had cracks all in his face like you." Tilda had squatted down, and Anthony traced one of her deep wrinkles. "He had lots of them, though." He ran back to me. "Can I keep them?" He held up the belts again. I was speechless. Tilda was crying silently. Anthony took my hand. "Go home now? That man said he would be there. And we play, Daddy. You can too."